When we began producing Shadow Government, we planned on making it 60 minutes. However, we ran into a problem: too much good material. So we made it 90 minutes, and we still had the same problem, and we had to leave some stuff off. Thankfully, these DVDs have these extra features where we can show you some of what was missing. To all of our experts who shared their time and expertise, thank you for making our job so difficult.
Janet Napolitano, the Director of Homeland Security here in the U.S., actually said that she would like to see those pass ID cards contain RFID to actually be remotely readable. And that raises a huge specter that if you've got a remotely readable RFID tagged driver's license in your pocket, in your backpack or your purse, a government official could read that without your knowledge from a distance from 15, 20, 30 feet away. They could just point a reader at you and read right through your pocket, right through your wallet, and get back your information and know who you are. It would be possible to put readers in doorways so that every doorway that you walk through would identify you right through the driver's license in your pocket. And there are plans right now by major corporations to actually avail themselves of that. IBM has patented something called the Person Tracking Unit. And their idea is that every time you walk into anywhere, whether it is their list is sports arenas, shopping malls, museums, theaters, libraries, even elevators and public restrooms, that every time you walked into one of those places, they would scan you. And if they saw an ID card in your pocket, if they saw an RFID tag woven into your clothing or tucked into your shoe, that they would actually identify you and track you.
NASA use similar frequencies to EPC in order to communicate with satellites. There's very, very long read ranges involved. It doesn't take much power. It's very easy to modify maybe a radar tower or just develop a high-power reading system that can read EDLs and passport cards from potentially multiple miles away.
More chillingly, they said that they would give that information to the federal government to aid in following suspicious persons. And it certainly seems to me, since September 11th, that the government's definition of suspicious people has expanded far beyond actual criminals to include all of us. So there really is, when you look at all this coming together, the government wanting to issue us these cards, combined with private companies like IBM wanting to install the readers in all of our public spaces. And we really could be to a point where, we could be denied access to buildings. We could be denied access to the bathroom or the elevator or the third floor, whatever it might be, on the basis of simply being monitored.
I actually like to use two different related terms. I talk about digital footprints and I talk about digital fingerprints. And the difference, both of these terms and the data shadow, refer to the picture of us that can be reconstructed from the data we generate in all of these ways through our transactions, through our use of telephones and computers and toll booth transponders. All of the rest of this produces data, particularly when it's aggregated together, can paint a very accurate picture of us.
So what we discovered was this grocery chain called Stop & Shop, owned by a multinational corporation called Royal Ahold, had created this enormous database to scan everything that people were buying. What that meant is that you could actually, or they could actually type in your name or your shopper card number and pull up a nutritional profile of everything you had bought for your household. They could tell if you were at risk for diabetes or high blood pressure or other health problems based on how you were eating. And when I asked Kurt Avalon, the Vice President for New Technology at Stop & Shop, why did you spend $3 million to come up with this program, what he told me was absolutely chilling. He said, we hope to recoup that investment by sharing the information with 2 or 3 HMOs. And if an HMO got a hold of a record, it was essentially a nutritional health record on you, they could use that to raise your rates, to cancel your policy, to deny you coverage for certain medical requirements that you had. Maybe you needed heart bypass. They'd say, no, too much Haagen-Dazs, too many hot dogs, and literally could deny you coverage, and you'd have no reason to ever even be told why that was the case.
We give away our purchasing history of food and perhaps alcohol and perhaps pharmaceuticals, at least over-the-counter ones that you buy in supermarkets, we give all that data to the supermarket and to the supermarket's parent company and to any business partners they have by using the loyalty card when we purchase stuff in order to get 20 cents off on a bag of potato chips. Okay, so there's an economist would say that kind of places a value on our sense of value on what our privacy about our food purchases is. Of course, we don't think about it that we don't think about that we're giving them that data. We're just thinking that they want to know that we're one of their regular customers. It doesn't occur to us when we do it that they're actually saving all the information that we're giving them.
So now that we have the technology to do it with closed-circuit surveillance cameras going in, RFID, microchips, and tracking devices going into identity documents, you've got really the global infrastructure to be able to track and monitor people everywhere, identify their political views, and potentially round people up who don't share the views of the regime in power.
My job is how do we get the new benefit and leave the expectation or requirement the same, and so that we don't see an erosion of it. So that's the number one thing. Under that kind of umbrella, lots of other liberties do come into play, and lots of other issues like liability issues, because sometimes privacy is the need to keep something. It's not so much about secrecy, but it's about a way of conducting oneself so that not everything you do is so exposed. A way to you have to be able to make mistakes. You have to be able to have some space of comfort. And we've always enjoyed that kind of freedom in a sense in the United States.
It's like the old saying, never take somebody's first offer because they're always going to be lowballing you. I think what we see over and over again in the sort of political and legal realm when it comes to privacy is that exaggerated, hysterical cases are made for why it is so important that you have to give this information up, or that your privacy is less important than what we're trying to protect.
There are communities around the United States that have passed laws saying that landlords cannot rent to a person without validating and verifying that person's legal status in this country. Now, that may sound like a good thing if you want to reduce illegal immigration, but once you create that infrastructure, again, it's all about what you're creating and how, if someone else takes charge of that infrastructure, what could be done. So once we have an infrastructure where the federal government can decide whether you can work or not, whether the local government can decide whether you can rent an apartment or not, where someone's deciding whether you can visit a doctor or not, then it's one thing today to say, well, the only people we're going to use that against are the illegal immigrants. But in the future, you could say, we're going to use that against the Christians, or we're going to use that against the Jews, or we're going to use that against the people with blue eyes, or the people who voted Democratic in the last election, or the people who voted Republican. It really, we have so many historical examples of that happening that the blindness, the sort of blinders on lack of recognizing that and not seeing what could be coming down the road is really, I think, one of the biggest dangers we face in this country.
Every once in a while, there will be a story about we couldn't do something because somebody didn't have the records. You'll get an anecdote, a scary anecdote, something that makes it sound like, gee, if we just had this program in place, the world would be a so much better place. And yet, so often, all there is a scary example. There isn't really a problem.
The more clever we are in communicating, the more clever government is in stopping us from communicating. There are 32 countries in the world who have almost complete control over computers, the internet, free press, or press, which isn't free in their countries, and people speaking out. So there are more ways to do that than there ever have been before. And besides those countries that have total control out of thought and speech, There are other countries who are attempting to do that.
The best definition of government I've ever heard is people who have sought power over other people and obtained it. So you've got people who want power. They're in power in government. And as the sort of cycle of corruption and oppression increases, then they want to hold on to power. And the best way to hold on to power, who opposes me? Who's figured out I'm corrupt? Who's figured out all of these terrible things I'm doing? And now I have power to destroy their lives, to make sure they can't get a job, to make sure they can't go to, they can't travel, they can't leave their homes, and ultimately the power to kill them. And we've seen this over and over throughout history. It's not a good idea to give them the power to shut you down and turn you off and eliminate you.
There are many individuals and many groups working for a world government. And when I speak of world government, I usually try and include the phrase based on the model of collectivism. Because world government by itself is neither good nor bad. I mean, I could even be a fan of world government myself if it were the right kind. The right kind of a world government based on the principles of individual liberty and respect for rights of the individual and freedom of choice and all of those things would be a wonderful thing. But that is not the kind of world government that's being built today. The kind that's being built today is on the model of collectivism, which means an all-powerful government, a kind of a government where the rulers at the top dictate everything and that the people at the bottom simply take orders. They're told what to do. They have no voice in their own political destiny at all.
Of course, they have all the money in the world. It's about controlling the entire planet. It's about subjugating 6.7 billion people to the whims of a very tiny minority who've been doing this for a very long time.
The downsides of a global government is that we will have a small set of very powerful people who will rule the world. And when you take a look at some of the things that they have said, for example, Prince Philip said that if he believed in reincarnation, he would come back as a virus so he could wipe out the population since we have too many people on the planet. When you listen to their statements, when you read their books, I do not want to be ruled by those kind of people.
Our money is simply made out of thin air by globalist bankers who now, in some places of the world, for over 250 years have been creating massive profits from this funny money system. And those massive profits have been used to coordinate the political actions of the world and buy up the resources, etc. It's this monetary power that comes from a system of fiat money that makes possible the globalist effort at sustainable development, which when done will make all human beings chattel of a ruling elite.
They set up the World Health Organization, and the health barriers between the countries fell. In 1994, they set up the World Trade Organization, and the trade barriers fell between the countries of the world. And then the legal barriers fell in 1998 when the International Criminal Court was set up. And for the first time since Rome, which was a world governmental structure, it was now possible that individuals like you and I could be tried on the international level at the International Criminal Court.
I was fired because I started saying no to criminality. You know, we police officers are told to commit crimes against the public. And as a Christian, I couldn't do that because they don't like you being a constitutionalist or being for the people. They want you to obey orders, whatever those orders are, and use you against the American people.
If you know that a system is going to be very much opposed to true Christians and will not allow them to hold the belief that Jesus Christ is the only way because they will argue it is not politically correct, it works against world peace, just making that statement. It's not all-inclusive in that sense. Then why, as Christians, would we want to support something like this when it will limit our freedoms or do away with them entirely once it comes about?
I went to a number of African countries, and I said, well, why don't you just pull out of the IMF World Bank? And the response from every delegate that I asked was the same. We can't. Well, you can't? Why can't you? don't you know, if we pull out, they will put economic sanctions on our country? I was shocked. I asked former Secretary General, he was then Secretary General, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, in 1995, are the countries of the world free to withdraw from the United Nations? And he looked at me and he said, oh, of course they are, but why would they want to do that?
Go to the source documents. The UN's Agenda 21 program is available on the web. There's a book that you can get. The second document that describes sustainable development is called the Global Biodiversity Assessment Report, also put out by the UN. And the third controlling document is the United Nations Earth Charter. In the words of the authors of the Earth Charter, the Earth Charter is to replace the Ten Commandments as the guiding principles for society. The Earth Charter was written by Stephen Rockefeller, who is Nelson Rockefeller's son, and Mikhail Gorbachev.
The environment's a very big issue. You know, global warming, the idea that there's something called anthropomorphic global warming. Now, this is ridiculous to begin with. I mean, even recent history proves that it's not anthropomorphic. Here's a news flash that I didn't have to go to university to learn. Global warming is caused by the sun. And when it got warm here, it got warm on Mars. There are hardly any trash on Mars. So, you know, this doesn't make any sense. But you see, if there is an anthropomorphic global warming, then that means that there's something that we can do. But we, as nations, are limited by the boundaries of our nation state. And so there has to be some kind of a supranational national body that isn't beholden to any one government who can make the hard decisions that are necessary.
Well, that gets you into an element of sustainable development. Its land use component has two aspects. One is called the Wildlands Project. And the Wildlands Project in the United States covers over 50% of the landscape of the U.S. And what is intended on that 50% is that all human engagement be terminated. So if you're living in an area that is now considered to become part of the Wildlands Project, you will be relocated. And people in rural areas are feeling the consequence of that policy increasingly all the time. It's becoming very difficult for ranchers and forest landowners to operate these days. Well, the purpose of that is to implement this Wildlands Project, which cleans out over half of the United States of human habitation. It also requires that no resources be extracted from these areas.
The idea now that wars are international affairs that need the approval of the United Nations, and so as a consequence of this, we have people that are outside of the nation state that are actually issuing what amount to almost royal commands. The definition of sovereignty is when you can impose taxes and you can impose capital punishment, and that pretty much defines what makes somebody sovereign. If I can demand tribute from you or order you put to death, I'm sovereign.
I believe the media has been and will continue to be a big part of the push for global government, because it's all about the minds of the people of the world and how to influence them to go along with this. Whoever controls the media will be able to set the tempo on this agenda.
When you control the media, you control the politicians, you control the banks, you control the money, you control the foundations, the think tanks. So when you understand how all these things work, you suddenly realize it's very simple to control. You don't need an evil guy with an evil eye, telling everybody what to do. Nobody will believe that. It's just much easier this way. I call a newspaper and say, you kill that story. That doesn't come out. You don't do this, that doesn't come out either. There's no secret societies. It's all a conspiracy theory, and of course people will believe it because, again, they've convinced us that if it's not on television, it doesn't exist.
I love both dogs and cats, but there's a difference between them, and that is that if you toss a pebble at a cat, typically the cat will freeze and look at the pebble. It'll just look at the pebble, and you toss another one, it'll look at the other pebble. But if you toss a pebble at a dog, he stops and looks at you. The dog has the innate intelligence to know that the pebble is not the problem so much as the source of the pebble. And I see too much in the world today where people are acting like cats. They're focused on this problem, that problem, and this problem. We've got to sound the alarm. We've got to write to our congressman. We've got to do something to stop this event from happening. When they don't think about who is making those events happen, they don't look at the source.
Back in the 19th century, there was a German philosopher by the name of George Hegel, and he developed a three-part dialectic that basically showed how a government could manipulate the masses in such a way so that they would demand something that previously to that they had been against.
Every one of these crises is pushing us closer, because if you look at what's happening in Washington, every crisis is followed by a whole bunch of legislation that's going to solve the crisis, and if you examine the legislation, it's just 1,000 or 2,000 pages of new limitations on your freedom. And it's an acknowledgement of internationalism. It's an establishment of treaties with other countries to solve these crises. We're now talking very aggressively about setting up a new international monetary system that's international. So it means we're giving up our sovereign money system.
For people to embrace a global political, economic, and religious system, they have to have a reason to do so first. If things are going fairly well in the world, people have most of what they want, the comforts of life, and they have freedoms, why would they go into a world government? There's no good reason for it. However, if they believe that we need a world government to save humanity from itself, lest we be destroyed because of wars, or if we need a world government to solve the environmental crisis, or any of a number of other problems, then perhaps they would be willing to go along with it. I have long felt that the Middle East would be used in a major way to set the stage for world government. If there is any kind of limited nuclear conflict in the Middle East, or even the threat thereof, where it appears that we are right on the brink, if someone steps on the scene and they have some type of proposal for world government that makes a lot of sense, that assures peace and unity among the nations and a fair economic system, I believe many people in the world would be prepared to take that as the solution.
That crisis can be whatever you like. It can be the plight of the poor. That's a great way to enlist them as as foot soldiers in the agenda. It can be a need for a health plan. It could be you can make just a whole list. Primary thing is to encroach on personal liberty and personal property. Everything that erodes liberty and property have always been linked together. So you attack one, you attack the other.
I believe that there are those individuals in the world who are so dark and heavily involved in the occult and dedicated to their agenda that if God permits it, they would try to bring about a cataclysmic event that would so shock people that they might then be willing to go along with the system of global government. I do believe that such individuals and groups exist. First of all, every person has a religious worldview. They may tell you they do not, but every person has a fundamental set of principles that guide their decision-making process. Religion drives politics, not the other way around. So if you understand where a person is coming from spiritually, you will be able to pretty accurately foretell how they are going to vote on a wide variety of issues. Secondly, the most powerful organizations pushing this one world movement have a spiritual dimension to them. And whether you're talking about organizations such as the World Constitution and Parliament Association, or Freemasonry, or the New Age movement as a whole, as you do the research and look into their writings, into their books, what their leaders are saying, there is always a religious connection. So you cannot separate religion from politics. It is simply impossible.
And we're going to have in America an anti-Christian atmosphere too. In fact, One of the most beloved Bible teachers in America was J. Vernon McGee. Several decades ago, he predicted that the real biblical believers in America will eventually have to go underground. That was a couple of decades ago. But he said something else. He says the attack against them will come from the denominational churches.
And although it's unpopular to say, we have to realize there are demonic spirits out there. And the Bible warns us that Satan masquerades as an angel of light. He can make things look so good. And people who are naive can easily be drawn in and support something that may sound good to them, but ultimately leads them down the wrong path. And again, you have two spirits at work here, one of God, one not of God, that is opposing the truth. And we need to be aware of that.
In roughly the 8th decade after Christ, the Apostle John had been exiled to the island of Patmos, which is an island off the coast of Greece, and he was living in a cave. And while he was in this cave, he was given a vision which forms, the contents of it is what we call the book of the Revelation. Now, remember that John is just a really, really simple guy. He's not particularly well educated, and he's in a cave. And it's like 1900 years ago, when a dowry might be a herd of goats. So, John writes, and he says, and he had the power to give life unto the image of the beast, and the image of the beast should both speak, and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. And he causeth all, small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in the right hand or in their foreheads, that no man could buy or sell except he had the mark, the name of the beast, or the number of his name.
I personally believe that every Christian has to believe that there is a spiritual conspiracy that is very active. If you study the Bible and you realize that Lucifer conspired with a third of the angels against God, and he was cast out of heaven because of it. Then when Adam and Eve were created, he conspired against God by trying to get man to sin. And we know that as history moves toward that final hour and a climax, that he is actively conspiring to gain what he's wanted all along, which is the worship of mankind. And what better way can you gain that than to have a world system centralized where you can force people into a situation where they have no other choice but to come under your authority or worship you if they want to eat, drink, or do anything else. Those people who would reject that would pay the consequences for it.
It wasn't just what John saw, but there's this overall sense that everything is coming together in a way that can only lead in one direction. It just so happens that it's the same direction that the prophets of the Bible saw. It's hard to argue against it when it exists and it sits before you. These events that are taking place that were prophesied so long ago all began at the same point in history. If you look at the revival of the Roman Empire, it began with the Benelux Treaty in 1948. If you look at the Cold War that shaped the last 40 years and has given us the political situation we have today, it began with the Berlin Airlift in 1948. If you look at the move towards fundamental religion, the World Council of Churches was formed in Amsterdam in 1948. If you want to examine the global economy and where it began with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, now the World Trade Organization, which was created by treaty in 1948 by the United Nations, which at that same time issued its charter to be a global government, which is the UN Declaration of Rights and Freedoms. All this came in conjunction with the restoration of Israel for the first time in 2,520 years on exactly the same piece of real estate from which they'd been scattered in AD 70, but precisely the way that Ezekiel said it would happen 2,520 years before. And that happened, and when that happened, everything else happened.
Your eternal destiny depends on it. In other words, these things are too important to delegate to others. And so my challenge to anyone to which these things are fresh and new and unknown is to find out yourself, not what Chuck Missler or somebody on the radio or TV says. Find out yourself what the Bible really says.
Now, Jesus gave a prophecy concerning the fig tree. The fig tree in the Old Testament, it's representative of Israel, I think, 33 times. And he says, learn the parable of the fig tree. When his branch is tender and it puts forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. When you see these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your head, for your redemption draweth nigh.